Mark and Julia Thompson were the picture of suburban stability until one night. Their shared bedroom fantasy spiraled into secret meetings, hidden surveillance, and a chilling plan that ended in murder. What began as an experiment to save their marriage became a twisted obsession that no one saw coming. Until it was too late. Mark Thompson was known around his neighborhood as a calm, thoughtful man who never raised his voice and always mowed his lawn on Saturdays. Their conversations were mostly logistical, their nights spent in separate corners of the house. They still cared for each other, but the intimacy they once shared felt like a distant memory. At first, she looked at him like he'd lost his mind. They met a few people online, chatted, and even had a couple of video calls. Nothing serious until they matched with Alex Romero. He stood out immediately. A freelance photographer in his early 30s, Alex was charming, articulate, and respectful. He didn't say anything, but the moment stuck with him. It showed Julia visiting places she never mentioned: bars on weeknights, quiet residential streets near Alex's apartment. He started creating fake online accounts, following her movements across social media, reading her texts when she left her devices unattended. He kept it all in a hidden folder on his computer. To him, it wasn't spying, it was evidence. Proof that he wasn't crazy. The fantasy they had agreed on was no longer exciting. It felt like humiliation. Julia, unaware of the surveillance, thought their marriage was adjusting. Every word she said felt like a lie. Every gesture felt rehearsed. One that would ensure he would never be cast aside again. One that would end the triangle permanently. She had no idea that her husband had been tracking her every move, building a narrative of betrayal in his mind. To Mark, this wasn't about open relationships or modern love anymore. It was about power, about what was his. She mentioned taking a short trip with Mark to reconnect, maybe spend time away from everything. But Mark had already crossed a mental threshold. He didn't want distance anymore. He wanted control. He wanted to feel like he mattered again. He began to wonder whether Alex was still following the rules or if he dewormed his way into something deeper. He never confronted her, not directly. Instead, he let the suspicion grow inside him, feeding it like a flame. He started noticing similar things: how she hesitated before answering questions, how she mentioned Alex even when the conversation had nothing to do with him. One afternoon, Mark casually asked if she'd seen Alex recently, and she said no. But later that night, he found an Uber receipt in their shared email inbox with Alex's address listed as the drop-off point. She had never done that before. He recovered some of the texts and read things that made his stomach twist. Julia called Alex babe. She said she missed him. He'd sit in his car outside Alex's apartment for hours, waiting to see Julia walk in or out. Once, he followed her to a bookstore where she met Alex in the parking lot. They didn't kiss, but they stood close, speaking in hushed voices. It looked intimate, too familiar. Mark took photos from his dashboard and uploaded them to his hidden folder. She mentioned being confused, unsure what she wanted anymore. Mark read those words over and over. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. He had a certain confidence that didn't feel forced. Julia seemed particularly taken with him, her eyes lighting up during their video chats. But after long conversations, multiple boundaries, and hours of reading, she agreed to at least consider it. All three of them laughed easily, and the atmosphere felt more relaxed than Mark had anticipated. He joined them for dinner, accompanied them on hikes, and even helped Julia with some photography for the gallery's next exhibit. Their arrangement was careful and measured. But it wasn't long before Mark noticed subtle changes. Julia smiled more often when she looked at her phone, when she talked about weekend plans, and especially when Alex was around. At first, Mark thought it was good. She was happy. But then he started wondering whether she was too happy. Alex wasn't threatening. He was friendly and attentive. When they finally took the next step a week later, it was awkward at first, but not in a bad way. Julia seemed happy. Mark felt a rush of adrenaline. He convinced himself that it was working, that this was the spark they needed. The rules would be strict. No emotional attachments, total honesty. Everything had to be mutual and discussed in advance. Mark reassured her that it would always be about them, never about replacing what they had. Mark tried different ways to rekindle the flame date nights, spontaneous gifts, even couples therapy. None of it worked. The distance remained quiet and persistent. He lived in a modest suburban house with his wife, Julia, in Mesa, Arizona. At first, he dismissed it, thinking it was a slippery slope to disaster. But the more he read, the more intrigued he became. The people in the thread talked about how sharing their partners had actually brought them closer, deepened their trust, and opened new levels of communication. It wasn't about cheating. It was about exploration together. To anyone looking from the outside, they seemed like a typical couple. Mark was a software engineer who worked from home, while Julia worked part-time at an art gallery downtown. They had no children, just a golden retriever named Milo and a kitchen full of air plants. Their routine was predictable and peaceful, but beneath the surface something was missing. Over time, Mark began to notice that the passion between him and Julia had dimmed. One evening, while browsing late-night forums and relationship advice blogs, Mark stumbled upon a thread discussing ethical non-monogamy. He thought about it for days before bringing it up to Julia. They created a profile on a private couples-only lifestyle site. It was more awkward than exciting at first. Their first in-person meeting took place at a cozy wine bar. In the weeks that followed, Alex became a regular visitor. One night, Mark walked into the kitchen to find Julia hurriedly locking her phone screen and slipping it into her pocket. That was when Mark's suspicion took hold. He began quietly tracking her phone using an old location-sharing feature they'd forgotten to disable. Julia had no idea what Mark was doing in the background. Mark began documenting everything: screenshots of text messages, time-stamped photos from the doorbell camera when Alex arrived or left, audio recordings of conversations through the baby monitor app he reconfigured. Things took another turn when Mark caught Julia deleting messages before going to bed. He stopped eating regularly. He barely slept. What began as a shared experience had mutated into something dark and isolating. By the time Julia suggested scaling things back with Alex, Mark had already stopped listening to her with empathy. And in his quiet, calculated way, he began to make a plan. The morning air in Mesa felt heavy as Mark sat at the kitchen table, staring at Julia's untouched cup of coffee. She had left early for work, or at least that's what she said. Just the sound of Milo's paws against the floor and the faint humming of the refrigerator. She looked calm, distracted, humming lightly to herself as she put her purse down and greeted Milo. Mark pretended not to watch her, but every movement she made was under scrutiny. Her phone buzzed once. She glanced at it and smiled. He booked a cheap motel 30 minutes away, then doubled back and parked near Alex's building. He kept everything in a locked drawer in the garage, hidden behind toolboxes and dusty paint cans. It had become a ritual. Every time Julia left the house, Mark tracked, watched, and documented. He wasn't looking for proof anymore. He already had that. He researched methods quietly, using a burner phone and incognito browsers. He's getting weird, so she had noticed. She was playing the game but not trusting him anymore. It was no longer about sharing or exploring together. Julia had taken a step outside the marriage and slammed the door behind her. And Alex was standing right there, waiting. Disposal techniques, tracking devices. He even purchased a voice recorder and planted it under Julia's car seat, hoping to capture conversations between her and Alex. He planned a weekend getaway. Just the two of them, to a cabin up north they had visited years ago. Whatever happened at that cabin, it would be the end of something, a marriage, a fantasy, or a life. Only time would decide which. A record of everything that had happened, every lie, every betrayal. They shared a few peaceful dinners, watched a movie together, even laughed once or twice. Julia looked relieved, maybe thinking the worst had passed, but Mark had simply shifted gears. He was no longer chasing love or trust. He was chasing closure in the most dangerous way imaginable. He titled it The Truth. It was meticulous, written like a case file. If anyone ever found it, they'd know the sequence of events that led to whatever came next. Mark wasn't planning for reconciliation anymore. He was planning for legacy. He pitched it as a reset, a chance to reconnect. Julia seemed hesitant but agreed. The date was set for 2 weeks away. Mark began preparing, not for romance, but for answers. He told Julia they'd take her car to save gas. She didn't argue. She never asked questions anymore. She seemed tired, resigned. Maybe she suspected something. Or maybe she still wanted to believe they could fix what was broken. He packed extra equipment, hidden cameras, sleeping pills, restraints he ordered online under a fake name. He told himself it was for protection, just in case. But deep down, he knew the trip would be a turning point. The first few recordings were silent or filled with static. But then one clip stood out. Julia and Alex talking in soft tones, laughing. Then a sentence from Julia. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. He's getting weird." He was waiting for the final moment, whatever it would be, that pushed him over the edge. He waited from late evening to early morning. Around midnight, the lights in Alex's apartment dimmed. An hour later, Julia walked out alone, looking disheveled and nervous. The message read, "You're being watched. Walk away while you still can," but nothing changed. If anything, their meetings became more frequent. Julia started leaving the house on random errands that lasted hours. Her explanations were thin grocery runs to stores across town, art supplies from obscure shops, long drives to clear her head. Mark took photos, zooming in on the look in her eyes. She looked guilty, or maybe just tired. He couldn't tell anymore. Mark noticed how she slid it face down on the counter, a move she never used to do. It confirmed what he already believed. She was slipping further and further away from him. She would sigh often, stare blankly at her phone, and fidget during dinner. Once, Mark caught her crying quietly in the bathroom, wiping her face before coming out and pretending everything was fine. He didn't confront her, he only observed. He didn't want to argue, he wanted her to feel safe, to trust him, so that she'd never see what was coming. He reviewed the folder he had labeled Julia Surveillance. Hundreds of files. Photos, texts, location logs, timestamps. He had even downloaded Alex's entire social media history, piecing together his movements, his circle of friends, even the ex-girlfriend he still occasionally messaged late at night. Now there were secret texts, hidden visits, and lies about where she spent her afternoons. Mark was no longer a willing participant. He was an outsider looking in, and the reality gnawed at him day and night. Mark didn't even recognize the person he had become. But he wasn't ashamed, he felt justified. He had already checked the location tracking. She wasn't at the gallery. Instead, she was parked outside a modest beige apartment complex on the edge of town. It was Alex's building. She had gone there again, without telling him. He became more withdrawn, no longer asking her about her day or offering to help with dinner. He stopped making physical contact. Instead, he studied her, watched her eyes when she answered questions, noted the exact time she left the house. His affection was replaced with obsession, and Julia didn't seem to notice, or maybe she chose not to. The sight of her name on that map screen lit a fire in Marcus' chest that burned hotter than anything he had ever felt before. He spent the entire day in silence. No music, no work calls. Julia returned home that evening wearing a loose gray cardigan and her hair in a bun. Mark's behavior changed in small but sharp ways. The rules they had originally set were long broken. Julia and Alex were seeing each other without Mark's consent. There was supposed to be full transparency. One weekend, Mark told Julia he had a work conference out of town. Back at home, Mark printed the photos and added them to a growing physical file. Julia, meanwhile, had started showing signs of stress. Alex remained a shadowy presence. Mark had tried once to confront him anonymously by sending a message through a fake social account. Mark began imagining scenarios, fantasies of exposing them both or disappearing one of them without a trace. Those words played in Mark's head for days. Mark tried one last time to restore control. He also started writing a document on his laptop, hidden in encrypted folders. It was a kind of journal, but also a justification. On the surface, things between Mark and Julia seemed to improve slightly. 2 days before the cabin trip, Mark purchased a used SUV off Craigslist and parked it several blocks away from their house. But Mark had made up his mind. There would be no going back. The cabin sat deep in the Arizona woods, surrounded by tall pines and long-forgotten dirt roads. The last gas station they passed was nearly an hour back, and Julia had already commented on how remote it felt. Mark had chosen it for that reason. It was isolated enough that no one would hear anything and remote enough that it wouldn't attract attention. If she did, she didn't let it show. She unpacked quietly, laying out their food supplies and stacking firewood by the hearth. Mark stayed up, staring at the fire until the embers turned to ash. "Went for a walk, don't worry." Mark panicked briefly. The forest was vast and unpredictable, with dozens of trails leading in different directions. He grabbed a pair of binoculars and checked the surrounding area from the back porch. Nothing, no footprints. No sound. He stood among the trees, staring up at the canopy of leaves, trying to convince himself that this was still reversible. She quickly turned off the screen when he walked in. He didn't ask questions. He simply sat down and stared at her until she became uncomfortable. In a flash of anger, Mark lunged forward, grabbing the device and throwing it against the wall. It shattered instantly. Milo barked. Julia stepped back, her face pale. Mark advanced slowly, the fire in his chest now fully alive. He documented every detail: what she wore, how long she was unconscious, her pulse rate, the sound of her breathing. He sat on the edge of the bed, unsure of what came next. Mark stared at the locked door and felt something unfamiliar. Not guilt, not fear. It was the slow, creeping realization that he had crossed a line that could never be undone. He hadn't planned this far. He thought there would be clarity, a moment of understanding, but all he felt was static. The cabin was silent, the forest beyond it still. It was clinical, detached, like he was recording data for an experiment. He didn't check on her for the rest of the night. He slept upstairs, fully dressed, the key to the basement in his pocket. He wasn't shouting, he wasn't even shaking. He was calm, resolved. Then he stood up and walked to the kitchen drawer. This time he didn't hesitate. A sedative worked quickly, numbing her limbs before she could resist. Mark tied her hands and feet, not tightly, but enough to keep her still. He sat beside her for hours, talking into the silence, explaining everything, what he knew, what he had seen, how long he had been watching. Julia was barely conscious, her eyes fluttering, her lips moving but no words coming out. That he could let her go, walk away and never look back. But the truth was clear, too much had already been broken. Julia stared at it in confusion. Mark opened it slowly, revealing the contents. She didn't speak. Her face was frozen, her eyes locked on the syringes and tape. Mark told her he just wanted to talk. That he needed her to tell him everything, the truth about Alex, about her feelings, about what she really wanted. When he finally stood and moved toward the locked drawer under the sink, his fingers trembled. She talked about a stream she found, how peaceful it was, how she felt like she could breathe again. Mark didn't respond. Julia even kissed him on the cheek, a gesture that felt both foreign and manipulative. He laid her on the cold floor and closed the door behind him. The basement had been prepared the day before, concrete cleaned, tools removed, the space cleared. He left a jug of water and a pillow, as if she were staying for a night and nothing more. Mark responded in kind, playing the role of the grateful husband, the one trying to make things right. But inside, he felt hollow. He watched her body language, the way she avoided eye contact when he mentioned the past, or how she carefully skirted around the topic of their arrangement with Alex. It was all rehearsed. Instead, he poured himself coffee and stared out the window. He had started to think she might be planning something. Maybe an escape? Maybe she had left to call someone? He hadn't disabled the signal booster she kept in her bag, but he considered it. If she was reaching out to Alex, he'd know soon enough. Inside was a small black case containing syringes, a vial of liquid sedative and a set of restraints. He placed it gently on the table, staring at it for nearly an hour, then returned it to the drawer untouched. She mentioned wanting to sketch the forest in the morning and maybe take a walk by herself. Mark nodded, offering small smiles, pretending to be a man trying to make peace with his wife. In truth, he had already made his decision. Something was going to happen that weekend. He just wasn't sure yet how far he would go. It had once belonged to Mark's late uncle, a place they'd visited in the early years of their marriage. Back then, it was filled with warmth and laughter. Now it felt like a grave. The inside was musty and dimly lit. A fireplace stood in the corner, unused for years. Cobwebs hung in the corners of the windows, and the floor creaked under every step. Mark had arrived the day before to prepare. He cleaned just enough to make it livable, but he left certain areas untouched. The upstairs bedroom remained locked. The tools in the shed undisturbed but easily accessible. He had tested the locks on the basement door 3 times. Julia didn't suspect anything. That first night they shared wine. Mark kept his behavior measured. He didn't press her with questions. He let her speak freely, waiting for clues in her words, any hint of regret or confession. But Julia remained guarded, even cheerful. She said she was glad they came, that it felt good to disconnect for a while. They sat by the fire, their dog Milo curled up nearby, the flickering flames casting long shadows on the walls. Mark watched her carefully, noting the moments when she checked her phone or when her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Around midnight, Julia went to bed, claiming exhaustion from the drive. The next morning, Julia was gone. Her jacket and boots were missing, and a note sat on the kitchen counter that simply read. She returned 2 hours later, her cheeks red from the cold, her mood calm. That afternoon, they played board games and cooked lunch together. Later that evening, Mark excused himself and walked into the woods with Milo. He needed time to think. He needed clarity. When he returned to the cabin, he found Julia sitting at the dining table, looking through her phone. He brought the black case to the table and set it down, but she didn't answer. Instead, she reached for her phone, a sudden motion that startled him. What happened next was quiet. He didn't scream. She didn't fight. He carried her to the basement, wrapping her in the same old blanket they had used during their first trip to the cabin. Upstairs, Mark opened his laptop and wrote a new entry in the truth. When he awoke the next morning, there was no sound from below. Somewhere below his feet, his wife lay bound and sedated. The days that followed in the cabin unfolded in eerie silence, as if time itself had stopped. Mark moved like a man in a trance, drifting through the rooms with robotic precision. He cooked simple meals he never ate, kept logs of the weather in his notebook, and recorded every hour of Julia's unconsciousness and revival. She awoke the second day, groggy, confused, her voice weak and hoarse. Mark didn't answer her questions. He didn't speak at all. He watched her through a peephole he had drilled in the basement door, tracking her movements as though she were an animal in a lab experiment. Mark noticed the color draining from her face, her body weakening. Panic started setting in. He didn't want her dead, not really. He wanted her still, yes, quiet, dependent, but not gone. He brought her more food, more water, even covered her with a second blanket. But her energy continued to drain. She asked to see a doctor. She begged to be taken home. Her words came in fragments, drifting between lucidity and confusion. Mark ignored the pleas, believing she would recover in time if she just stopped resisting. The fire had long since gone out, and the cabin was freezing. He didn't cry, he didn't scream. He just stared, blank and broken. In his mind, something fractured. All the justifications, the twisted reasoning, the delusions of control gone. All that remained was the unmovable reality of what he had done. She had stopped struggling by the third day. The restraints stayed on, though looser now, and he began bringing her food and water, which she refused at first. He wrapped Julia's body in the same tarp he had used to cover the firewood outside. But inside, he was already buried next to Julia in that shallow grave, under the dirt and guilt, rotting slowly in silence. He duct-taped the ends, sealing her in like an object, something that no longer resembled the woman he had once loved. He placed her in the back of the SUV and drove for hours, deep into the mountains, down winding gravel roads where cell service vanished and no one would follow. Mark sat by the locked basement door for hours, his ears pressed against the wood, waiting to hear anything. Mark kept his composure, explained her supposed travel plans, showed them her packed suitcase and train ticket stub he had planted in the closet. The officers left, unconvinced but without evidence. Mark knew it wouldn't last. He felt it creeping closer the moment when everything would collapse. He worked mechanically, the spade cutting through frozen soil, sweat freezing against his back. When the hole was deep enough, he lowered the tarp-wrapped body in, covering it with dirt, rocks, and rotted wood. He left no markers. No trace. The silence that came back was louder than screams. He finally unlocked the door and descended the steps, flashlight in hand. What he saw made his knees buckle. It contained his folder of surveillance, his journal, and audio files from the cabin, his final documentation. He told himself it was proof of the truth, that one day someone would find it and understand what drove him here. He returned to the cabin, cleaned what he could, and burned the blood-stained blanket in the fire pit behind the house. She turned her head weakly, unable to lift her arms. He told neighbors that Julia had decided to visit family in another state. He even sent a few texts from her phone to reinforce the lie, but as the days passed, people grew suspicious. Julia missed appointments. She didn't return calls. Her coworkers filed a missing persons report. He panicked, realizing that she was closer to death than he had intended. His mind raced with options. Hospital, no too many questions. Drop her somewhere anonymously? Risky. Say she had gone missing in the woods? Possibly, but every scenario led back to him. He had left digital trails, a physical log, and photos. Everything pointed back to him. Eventually, hunger forced her to accept. He never looked directly into her eyes when he delivered the meals. Her eyes fluttered open when the light hit her face, but she didn't speak. Mark rushed to her side, calling her name, shaking her gently. Mark stayed beside her, wetting her lips with water, whispering apologies she couldn't hear. He wrapped her fingers in his hands, remembering the night they first met, the first movie they watched, their wedding day. It felt like a lifetime ago. She didn't respond. He checked her pulse faint, but still there. He carried her upstairs and laid her on the living room couch, wrapping her in blankets. For the first time in days, he spoke aloud, pleading with her to stay awake, to eat, to drink. He placed the tray on the floor, back away, and closed the door behind him. When the wind outside howled against the windows, and the shadows in the corners of the room began to twist, Mark would lie awake questioning whether he had misunderstood it all. Maybe Julia was lost, not malicious. Maybe she had drifted emotionally like many people do, and Alex had simply been there when she needed someone. These thoughts terrified him more than any crime he could commit. Because if it wasn't betrayal, if it wasn't manipulation, then it was Mark who had failed. And he couldn't live with that version of the truth. Each time, he would sit outside the basement door and listen. She cried sometimes. Other times, she sat in silence. He documented it all, recording the number of steps she took, the time she slept, the frequency of her breathing when she was awake. Back upstairs, Mark rewatched the old videos from happier times beach vacations, birthday parties, holiday dinners. He paused the clips on Julia's face, studying her expressions, trying to match them with the person now hidden below. He convinced himself he was saving her from herself, that Alex had changed her, that the open relationship had poisoned their marriage. He repeated it in his mind like a mantra. She was someone else now, someone dangerous. He had no choice. But doubt crept in during the quietest hours. Julia's condition began to deteriorate. She barely moved. Her voice was raspy from dehydration. One night, Julia stopped speaking altogether. Julia lay motionless on the floor, her skin pale, her breathing shallow. He made soup, tried feeding her with a spoon, but her body rejected it. As the hours passed, Julia drifted in and out of consciousness. By morning, she was gone. Mark sat in the armchair next to her body, frozen, barely breathing. He spent the next day in silence, avoiding mirrors, avoiding light. There, under the floor of a rotting shed on abandoned property once owned by his family, Mark dug a shallow grave. Before he left, he placed a small flash drive inside the tarp. Mark drove home in silence. He deleted accounts, destroyed the burner phone, and wiped the hard drive of his laptop. Within a week, the police arrived at his door. Still, he waited. He kept mowing the lawn on Saturdays. He waved at neighbors. The investigation into Julia Thompson's disappearance began slowly, as many do. At first, it was treated as a missing persons case routine, non-criminal, and without any clear signs of foul play. The train ticket Mark showed them had no digital confirmation or payment record. A few neighbors remembered hearing raised voices from the Thompsons' house in the days before Julia vanished. Another mentioned seeing Mark loading something large into the back of an unfamiliar SUV. Still, there was no body, no weapon, no confession. He paced at night, obsessively checking news coverage and police statements online. Plans were underway to clear the old structures and build vacation cabins. Julia had been found. 6 months after Julia's disappearance, construction crews arrived at the abandoned property. It contained dozens of audio files, surveillance logs, text screenshots, photos, and a chilling document titled The Truth. When officers placed him in handcuffs, he remained calm, almost relieved. But the prosecution painted a different picture: a man obsessed with control, consumed by jealousy, and capable of cold, calculated murder. After 3 weeks of testimony and 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder, false imprisonment, and tampering with evidence. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At the station, he refused to speak without a lawyer, but the damage was done. He disappeared from public life shortly after the trial, refusing interviews and relocating out of state. Her story, though devastating, became a lifeline for others. Survivors came forward, sharing their own stories of control, isolation, and fear. Laws were proposed in Arizona to recognize and address coercive behavior patterns in relationships, what some called invisible violence. Julia's case became the face of that movement. Julia's parents created a foundation in her name, focused on helping women escape controlling relationships and domestic emotional abuse, those invisible signs often dismissed until it's too late. No one knew exactly what went through his mind in those final days at the cabin, but the world remembered what came after. The story wasn't just about a man who couldn't handle losing his wife. It was about the dangers of control disguised as love, and how quickly the line between passion and possession can vanish. The evidence was overwhelming. Every file on the drive matched devices in his home. Guards said he often sat alone in his cell, reading old science fiction novels or staring at the walls for hours. The prison psychiatrist labeled him cooperative but emotionally disengaged. He never expressed remorse, never admitted wrongdoing, never spoke her name again. The syringe and sedatives listed in the document were found hidden in his garage. His own handwriting betrayed him, right down to the final entry. "I didn't want it to end this way, but at least I have control again." Experts dissected Mark's journals, tracing the red flags that escalated over time: emotional withdrawal, surveillance, manipulation, and finally, violence. The lessons were clear: abuse isn't always loud. Sometimes it comes in silence, in watching eyes, in whispered justifications, in fantasies that slowly rot into something monstrous. It was Mark's own diary, written like a manifesto. It described his suspicions, his resentment, his surveillance, and finally his justifications for what he had done. It wasn't just evidence, it was a confession wrapped in delusion. When they broke through the rotting floorboards of the old shed, they discovered the disturbed earth. Hours later, a shallow grave was unearthed. Inside was a woman's decomposing body wrapped in a plastic tarp with duct tape sealing the edges. The jury heard his voice in the recordings. They saw his photos. They read his twisted logic. Julia's parents gave heart-wrenching statements about the daughter they lost, describing her as kind, creative, and full of life. Mark never looked up, he didn't cry, he didn't speak in his own defense. He visited the site where he had buried Julia 3 times, making sure the grave remained undisturbed. Each time he felt a chill in his bones that no coat could warm. He convinced himself no one would ever find her, that he had done everything right, just whispers of something darker. Her phone went dead the same night Mark said she left town. The local news ran her photo every night, smiling, happy, unaware of the fate she'd met. Community members organized search parties in nearby forests and hiking trails. Mark even participated in one, walking alongside volunteers with a flashlight and fake concern. He kept his face blank, emotionless, practicing the role of the grieving husband so thoroughly it became second nature. Her car was found parked behind a community center 2 towns away, untouched, keys still inside. Nothing about the situation made sense. Julia's friends and co-workers told police she had recently seemed distant and distracted, but no one had seen her in any emotional distress. Mark claimed she had gone to visit her cousin in Flagstaff, offering up a fabricated story about a last-minute train she'd taken. When pressed for details, he kept his answers vague but calm, never once raising suspicion with overt panic or emotion. Detectives noted the inconsistencies immediately. Julia's cousin hadn't heard from her in over a year. For weeks, investigators circled Mark carefully. They asked for access to phone records, reviewed security camera footage from nearby gas stations and highways, and spoke with neighbors. Julia's disappearance gained media attention. But behind the scenes, Mark was unraveling. The house was colder, quieter. He barely touched the meals he made. What he didn't know was that the land where he buried her had recently been sold to a private developer. Police were immediately called. The body was sent for examination, and although time had damaged most identifiers, dental records and a small heart-shaped necklace confirmed the worst. Inside the tarp, detectives discovered something unexpected: a small flash drive, sealed in plastic and wedged against her side. Mark was arrested at his home 2 days later. He didn't resist. The trial captured national attention. Mark sat in court stone-faced as prosecutors laid out the sequence of events. The defense team argued that Mark was mentally unstable, that he'd been pushed beyond reason by betrayal and emotional breakdown. Alex Romero, once considered a potential suspect, was cleared of any involvement. In prison, Mark remained silent. He refused media requests, declined therapy, and avoided interactions with other inmates. Documentary filmmakers began picking up the story, presenting it as a modern tragedy, a tale of trust corrupted, of a marriage turned sinister, of a fantasy that evolved into obsession and ended in death. Years later, the case remained a chilling example used in psychology courses and domestic violence seminars. Julia's legacy lived on through the foundation in her name. And Mark Thompson, the man who once believed he was saving his marriage, became something else entirely in the eyes of the world, a calculated murderer who mistook obsession for love and left a trail of silence in his wake. Not with forgiveness, not with understanding, but with a warning.